My name is Stephanie Lee. I'm the president of a student organization at Maxwell known as the Coalition of Multicultural Public Administration Students, otherwise known as COMPAS. We are public administration and international relations students from diverse backgrounds and countries of citizenship who are interested in exploring public policy issues from international perspectives and facilitating greater understanding and exposure to intercultural and multicultural issues. In keeping with our mission, this is the second of a series of panels designed to address misperceptions and representations of regions in the world that have figured prominently in policy discussions in the U.S. and are frequently depicted in problematic ways. The recent presidential elections, for example, depicted China as a threat, a cheater, and a currency manipulator. The hope of these discussions is to dig a little deeper than what the U.S. media typically represents in an effort to gain greater understanding. This panel is co-sponsored by COMPAS and the Maxwell School's East Asia program. So just to start out, to give you an idea of the format for tonight's event, each of our speakers will speak for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll follow that with a Q&A session. And there will be a reception outside following the event. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists for tonight. First, we'll have Dean James Steinberg. He is the Dean of the Maxwell School at Syracuse University and University Professor of Social Science, International Affairs, and Law. Prior to becoming Dean, he served as Deputy Secretary of State, serving as the Principal Deputy to Secretary Clinton. From 2005 to 2008, Steinberg was Dean of the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs, and prior to that, he was the Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution, where he supervised a wide-ranging research program on U.S. foreign policy. Mr. Steinberg's most recent book is Difficult Transitions, Foreign Policy Troubles at the Outset of Presidential Power with Kurt Campbell. Mr. Steinberg received his BA from Harvard and a JD from Yale Law School. He will be speaking tonight about security and international policy. Following him, we'll have Professor Mary Lovely, who is the Melvin A. Eggers Economics Faculty Scholar and Professor of Economics at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, where she also serves as chair of the International Relations Program. Dr. Lovely's recent research projects focus on innovation in the Chinese solar equipment industry, the pollution intensity of Chinese exports, differences in China's integration into American and Japanese production networks, and the influence of market access on the geographic dispersion of manufacturing wages. Her work has been published in the Review of Economics and Statistics, the Journal of International Economics, and the Journal of Public Economics, among others. She serves as co-editor of the China Economic Review and recently was guest editor for an issue of the Journal of Asian Economics that focused on deeper economic integration of the U.S., Japan, and China. She earned a PhD in economics from the University of Michigan and a master's degree in city and regional planning from Harvard University. She will be speaking tonight on economics and trade in China and the U.S. And finally, we'll have Terry Lautz, who is the interim director of the East Asia program here at the Maxwell School, where he teaches on the history and politics of U.S. China and U.S. Asia relations. His recent publications deal with Sino-American cultural and educational relations, mutual perceptions, and missionary history. Dr. Lautz is a director of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and was formerly the vice president of the Henry Luce Foundation in New York. He holds a BA from Harvard College and a PhD from Stanford University. He will be speaking tonight about culture, education, and public diplomacy. So now it is with great pleasure that we welcome our panelists.
Well, thanks very much. I think I have the privilege of going first here. I'm very honored to do and honored to share the platform with two wonderful colleagues. It's a great topic, and good to see such a good turnout here. The discussion, I think all of us are looking forward to Q&A. It's always the best part of these kinds of discussions. I'm going to talk about security policy and international policy, and for the IR students in the room, the issue of perception and misperception, of course, is a familiar one in international relations. Very distinguished colleague Bob Jarvis wrote a very important piece of IR theory about the challenge of perceptions and misperceptions. And I think in dealing with China, it's important to recognize that there are two very different kinds of problems of perception and misperception. One is the structural problem that Bob wrote about in his book, the fundamental problems in international relations, about how states interact with each other and how and what tools they have available to understand each other's intentions, both present and future intentions, and the kind of structural problems of having and building trust in the international context pose. And then the specific problems of perception and misperception that relate to the U.S. China relationship. And I think that both are quite important, and you can't understand the challenges of dealing with U.S. China relations without understanding of both parts. The structural part, of course, has a long history in U.S. China relations, but has become especially significant as China's economic success has propelled it to a point where it becomes a significant power with significant capabilities of its own on the international stage, a more capable military, a more active role on the international stage, raising the fundamental issue, which has been familiar in international relations, at least since Thucydides, about the relationship between an established power, the United States, and a rising power, China, and the difficulties of managing that relationship. As we know from history, these are fraught relationships that often end up in conflict, often because of problems of perception and misperception. Each side worrying about what the other's intentions are, each side believing that it's taking measures to protect its own security, or take other measures which are, in the eyes of the actor, benign, but are seen as potentially problematic from the other side. And so, as an established power, the United States has a stake in the existing system. We believe very strongly in our own narrative, which is the United States is a powerful country, but it uses its power for benign purposes, for its own self-defense, and for producing global public goods, protecting our friends and allies, maintaining freedom of access, freedom of navigation, and the like, and that therefore the current arrangements are ones which are obviously beneficial to the United States, but not unbeneficial to others, including the rising powers. And indeed, from the U.S. perspective, there's a perception that the international order that we underpin, that we spend lots of money on, has actually been the predicate and the circumstances that has allowed China to move forward, to develop economically, and to be able to produce all the benefits it's produced to its own people. Now, from the perception of China as any rising state, it's not so obvious. Yes, there have been benefits to China for the global order that the United States provides, but it's also one that depends on people acquiescing in the United States being the country that calls the shots. And for a rising country which has anxieties about depending on others to provide for their own security, that's not as comfortable a position to be in as being able to take care of your own security and have the capability to protect your own security. So for a rising power like China, the first best is to have enough capacity, political, economic, military, to provide for your own security. But, not surprisingly, as it does that, and in China's own eyes, as with other rising powers, legitimately taking measures to provide for its own national security and self-defense, those very capabilities that it sees as defensive can be seen in the eyes of others, including the United States, but also the United States' friends, as at least potentially threatening to the established powers. So you have what the IR crowd calls a security dilemma, each side acting in ways which it believes are at a minimum benign and potentially even more beneficial to the international order, but which through the eyes of the other can be seen as potentially threatening. And that's a structural problem. It doesn't have anything to do with who the leaders of the countries are, doesn't have anything to do with what their history is, their culture, their tradition, their political system. Like, it's just the nature of the problem of security, which is what looks like the ability to provide self-defense and defensive security inherently has the capability of looking threatening to the others. So that's a management problem that the United States and China have to deal with. And as I said, historically, countries have not managed that well. That more often than not, though not inevitably, those structural relationships have led to conflict. Now, there are also structural reasons that theorists and practitioners point to suggest that while this is an inherent tension, that there may be reasons structurally also to be less afraid. For example, the fact of the interdependence between the two countries, which we'll talk about on the economic side, gives reasons for each side to have structural reasons to try and mitigate those conflicts. The fact that each side is so invested in the success of the other for their own success that whatever anxieties they might have, that they have to be tempered by a fear that a conflict will be a lose-lose proposition, and that there's not the possibility of gaining at the other's expense, that either side can both lose by pursuing the conflict. So there are reasons, notwithstanding the structural reasons for conflict, for the two sides to try to manage this complex relationship. But I think in the case of the United States and China, the problems they run deeper than the IR theorist problems. And they have to do with the traditions, culture, and history of the two sides and their interaction with one another. Now, it is certainly the case that there have been periods in U.S. China history where, at least in relative terms, the two sides have had a positive relationship. During the early years of interaction between a relatively new United States and a much older China, in many ways, at least compared to other non-Asian powers, and if you compare to some Asian powers, the United States was seen as a relatively benign force. But Terry may have a few things to say about that as well. It was during the era of the open door and the like. The United States certainly had its own parochial economic and political interest in China, but compared to the European imperial powers, it certainly had a less rapacious, I would say, approach, and therefore generated less, I think, hostility within China as a kind of a broad proposition than some of the other powers. Certainly in the early years of the Chinese Republic and the positive reaction to the establishment of the Republic of China, it was a period, a positive period. And perhaps most importantly, during World War II, when the United States and China were allies against Japan, it was a period in which the two sides' interests converged and there was a positive experience. But even during those periods, there were tensions, during periods of the open door, and indeed even during the period of the joint efforts against Japan, there were tensions in the relationship. But not surprisingly, since memories are not very long in this case, that the most prevalent historical images were deeply affected by the Communist Revolution in China and the aftermath in terms of how that shaped American politics and the American reaction to China. And although we have a brief period in American history where the leadership of the United States, Truman and Marshall, tried to manage the relationship with China and saw advantages of having a constructive relationship with China even after the Communist Revolution, that soon got drowned out for a variety of reasons that we can discuss in a broader paradigm that saw the communist world in monolithic terms in a black and white contest and painted China as an ideological as well as political adversary of the United States, and created a period of close to 30 years, 25 years, where it became very difficult for the United States to engage positively, and indeed in the American political life, China became demonized, and obviously that had an impact in return to China, rather than welcoming the Communist Revolution as a liberation of the Chinese people from a government which was not responsive to the needs of the Chinese people. The United States was seen as being allied with forces that didn't have China's best interests at heart. And that political and historical narrative, I think, has had an important shaping terms, notwithstanding the warmth and the improvement of the relationship after the Nixon visit and the like. Because even during that period, so much of what drove the American policy was not necessarily a positive security view about China itself, but rather how China played in the Cold War context as a balancing force against the Soviet Union. And so quickly, as the events changed, first on human rights grounds, but then later on political grounds, the image in America of China became one that had to be managed and was often exploited in ways that you've heard, including in the last election, but indeed in all elections for the past 40 years, as questioning China's intentions, China's purposes, indeed even China's legitimacy. And although when you look at policy over the past 40 years, there's been a lot of continuity. If you look at politics over the last 40 years, you heard in the last election the demonization of China, which tended to focus on economic issues, but the demonization has been much stronger. And challengers running for national office in the United States, really dating back to the beginning of the 40s, obviously, but even through the periods of rapprochement, often criticized incumbent presidents for being too close to China. Reagan's criticism of Ford, and then Carter's criticism, the criticism of Carter by Reagan running for office, Clinton's criticism of the first Bush, President Bush, Bush 41, after Tiananmen, and so on, up to the present. There's been a tendency to see the opportunity to post China as a threat or as a problem, as an important force in shaping and being an advantage in American politics. And that, of course, needless to say, mirror images on the Chinese side, which is as China becomes more and more open to and able to access American media press, these characterizations, these views about China are played out and available to the Chinese public. And so we've seen over the past 30 years a significant decline in Chinese attitudes, positive views about the United States, increasingly large number of Chinese interpreting U.S. policy as one of being hostile to Chinese success, being designed to contain China and the like. And that notwithstanding the fact that the kind of declaratory and high policy of the United States over the period since 1971 has been the relatively positive one of China. You don't hear presidents talking about containment, you don't hear the declaratory policy of the United States being hostile, but this background has led more and more Chinese to perceive this as a problem. And I think it also relates to how each sees its own national security policy. The United States believes in American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States, because of our own moral foundations and the roots of our own national power in our own democracy and our own commitment to human rights, tends to view American power not through a kind of traditional realist lens, but rather as a benign hegemon that's acting in ways that advance broader interests, that conforms to broader moral principles in our international relations, and therefore justifies the United States playing an especially leading role. But what I think few Americans understand is that there's an equivalent narrative in China that looks to the period when China was a powerful nation during the Ming Dynasty and the exaltation of the famous travels of Admiral Zheng He around the world, in which when China was a dominant power, that it also used its power for benign purposes, for advancing the well-being not just of the Chinese nation, but of others as well, facilitating trade, of advancing and improving the standards of living of countries around the world and the like. So two countries, each of which define their own power in benign ways, and yet each seeing each other through a lens that questions that. And the fact of these two different narratives, each of which justifies for their own nation their right to play a leading, if not dominant role, creates this inherent tension because you can't have both doing the same at the same time. And so again, a structural problem, but one that is very unique to the histories of these two countries and the way in which they see their roles, and the kind of sense that each, in some respects, has the mantle of heaven that justifies their role internationally. So you have both issues that are structural and issues that are specific to the two countries in their own security and narratives and their interaction with each other that causes problems. And then the challenge is what can be done about it. Now, what most of the discussion about these things tends to be talking about building strategic mutual trust. If you look at the dialogues, the statements that come from the leaders on both sides over quite a long period of time, A focal point is the idea that what we need to do is build strategic mutual trust, understand their interests in common, that we can collaborate with each other. And yet for all these commitments to building strategic mutual trust, all these problems remain. And I think the deep problem that we face here is that notwithstanding what one can take for the purposes of argument, good faith on both sides about their intentions and their beliefs, there's no particular mechanism to make that convincing or compelling to the other side, because each side has to worry that this is all just a pretext, that this is all just a positive excuse to try to justify a set of policies which are not nearly so benign. And so now going forward, the challenge for both sides is to take what is obviously in some rational level in their interest, to manage these perception and misperception problems, to try to create some confidence in each other's intentions, and do so in ways that are convincing to the opposite side. And particularly convincing in ways that are not just convincing for current leaders, but also convincing for the future. To be able to persuade that not only does the current leadership in the United States have a positive and positive sum view about U.S. China relations, but that future presidents will have it. That not only current leaders in China have a positive view about U.S. China relations, but that future leaders will have it. And so now, I think the key challenge going forward is what can each side do to be convincing to the other side that the long-term intentions are positive and cooperative, that there is a reason to believe that future intentions will not deviate from that, and therefore it's worth building strategies based on a positive and confident view about the future rather than one of hedging, of assuming the worst and preparing for the worst. And there I think the challenge goes to what are the concrete steps that each side can take to give each other the confidence in each other's intentions, so that you don't have to rely on people trusting each other, but rather can believe that there are structural reasons and concrete steps that each side can take. And I'm happy to come back in the Q&A to talk about what some of those things might be.
Okay, I guess the ball is thrown into my court. I thought that I would pick up on Jim's very interesting point that each side sees their own power as benign, but has, through some lenses at least, looks at the other's intentions, purposes, and even integrity with skepticism and concern. I want to talk about the trade relationship and the tensions that can arise in the trade relationship, and maybe some ways in which those tensions can be diffused. I think it's important to step back for a minute and realize how far China has come. We all know there's a lot of superlatives and numbers never seem capable of being large enough when you deal with China, but for 3 decades, China's growth rate has been about 90% per year, which is just a phenomenal number. And I think it's unrealistic to think that the absorption into the world economy of a country whose labor force is growing at 2.3% per year, and is a very large labor force at that it's going to be smooth and easy. Just was never in the cards. It's amazing that it has been as smooth and as uncontentious as it has been. It's been a tremendous transition. It's certainly, in some sense, the event of, the world event of international economists in my generation career. So I think it's worthwhile to pause and realize that we've peacefully come a very, very long way in terms of integrating China into the global economy. In the process, we have greatly reduced global poverty. Some people feel that, mistakenly, that China's comparative advantage is based on low wages, which of course completely misunderstands the theory of comparative advantage, but also sort of assumes that China wants to develop by keeping low wages, which is kind of ironic, since the whole point of development is to raise wages. But it's important to realize that real wages in China have risen quite rapidly. Between 1995 and 2007, urban real wages grew by 11.2%. That certainly is revolutionary. Just think for a minute what it would be like in the United States if we were having real wages per capita growing anywhere near that level. Rural areas, of course, have not seen quite as rapid increase, but they still grew at an average of 6.3% between 1995 and 2007. So we're having tremendous income growth across the entire country. Of course, that doesn't mean that it isn't without problems. We've all heard about increasing income inequality in China, both across regions of China, particularly between urban areas and rural areas. There are several different measures of the ratio of urban to rural per capita income. The Chinese National Bureau of Statistics puts the ratio of urban to rural income at more than 3 times. So urban areas more than 3 times as rich as rural areas, both in income and wealth, which is about the same. Surveys done by an international consortium of scholars put the ratio about 4. So there's tremendous urban-rural income disparity in the country. We also know there's a tremendous generation of wealth leads to tremendous concentration of wealth. So there's many new billionaires in China, and of course many, many millionaires in China, but also the concomitant problems of corruption that go along with that rapid generation of wealth. Along with inequality, I think a overwhelming problem with the growth is environmental issues, which have moved very much into the forefront in the past year, but of course have a long history in China. And they didn't get here overnight. There is just a persistent degradation of the environment, which has severely challenged China's capacity to recover. At some point, dead rivers are not easily resurrected. And in some areas, China may be getting perilously close to that level, faster than I think a lot of people could have foreseen. Now, what about its relationship with the United States? Well, Jim talked a lot about the security and political situation and perceptions of the two. It is true that they're very important trading partners. If we take the entire EU 27 and count them as one country, China is still a #4 export destination for the United States. I think many Americans are used to thinking about China as a source of imports. But we don't realize that it's also a very large market for us to sell our goods and services. If we, of course, didn't take the EU as one gigantic block, China would be #2. If we look at the source of our imports, China is #2, so it clearly is a very important source of imports for the United States. The United States, of course, has billions of dollars of foreign direct investment in China, and some of that, of course, is U.S. corporations that are using China as a location for outsourcing of labor-intensive activities. But detailed surveys of American corporations show that American corporations are largely using China either as a market or a place to create goods that then sold to third markets. So unlike some of our Asian partners, the United States mainly produces in China for the Chinese and more broadly the East Asian market. Having said that, when we look at the imports, the goods and services that come back to the United States, more than 50% of those are produced by foreign invested enterprises inside China. So when we think about retaliating against imports that we may think are unfairly priced, largely we are basically investigating the practices of other trading partners, that is other than China. Those are Taiwanese firms, Japanese firms, European firms that have invested in Chinese production facilities and producing goods that are then re-exported to the United States. So it's a very complicated relationship and one that clearly involves more countries than just the 2 trading partners. I didn't mention yet global imbalances, but of course we all know that China holds a great deal of American IOUs. One count that I just saw from the Council on Foreign Relations had China's holdings of U.S. treasuries and agency debt, which was equal to about $1,000 per capita. So they're an important source of funding for us. So that's a little bit about the relationship. What can we think of as this succession? I interpret it as looking at ways in which we may see conflicts and ways in which perception might matter in terms of reducing tensions or resolving those conflicts peacefully. One thing is that China is increasingly two economies. So the coast is really, we can think of as a medium income country already. It's very good at imitation, incremental innovation, and absorption of new technologies. It has a relatively high-skilled, medium-skilled labor force, and it's very capable of moving up the ladder in terms of the goods and services that it can produce competitively, and therefore likely to be a source of continuing trade friction. When we couple with that the fact that right in its backyard, literally, is the interior provinces, which will remain lower wage areas, they have a very strong ability to produce goods that will continue to rock global markets. A second and I think intertwined factor is China's intervention into some sectors, and now into the announced 7 strategic sectors, which we don't actually know how that will play out. But one area we have seen conflict in is, of course, something I've been doing work on, which is solar equipment manufacturing. Solar equipment manufacturing has benefited primarily from access to low-cost loans from state banks and very rapid expansion of capacity within China. China's entry into this market and its ability to very rapidly gain global market share is nothing short of breathtaking. And it took, I think, the West somewhat by surprise. Of course, now with the reduction in subsidies from European countries, which are basically keeping this market afloat, we've seen that there is a global oversupply. And some of you may have seen that Suntech, which at one point was the largest solar equipment manufacturer in the world, has recently asked for bankruptcy, has entered bankruptcy proceedings. Nevertheless, trade conflict on solar equipment continues. The U.S. asked for basically levy countervailing duties originally. Countervailing duties are just a tax on Chinese imports, which are meant to offset what are viewed as Chinese subsidization of the exports. Those taxes get defined through a process internal to the U.S. government, and they were relatively benign. They were something on the order of 3 to 4%. There was a second request from the industry for anti-dumping duties against Chinese solar equipment, arguing that they were being sold below average cost, probably true. And the decision, which is taken jointly by the International Trade Commission and the U.S. Department of Commerce, was to levy anti-dumping duties on the order of 30 to 35%. And that definitely had an effect on the market. So you can see that this is trade tensions clearly happening already. I think that we're lucky, we're fortunate to live in a world in which these kinds of issues can be mediated through the World Trade Organization. And Jim talked a lot about the bilateral relationship, but I think it's also important to remember that these two countries are not operating in a vacuum, that we do have some multilateral institutions that can help play a role in mediating the tensions that arise. As I said before, we're very fortunate that China's rapid growth has occurred so far within a peaceful setting, and to continue that, we need to have sort of buffers and abilities of countries to respond when they feel that they have maybe been subject to unfair trade or other unfair practices, and then also to have a way to moderate those. Okay, rebalancing. I say I have 2 minutes. Let me talk a little bit about rebalancing, because that's really important in the U.S. context. We all know that the United States consumes more than it produces, and therefore it's a global borrower. China produces more than it consumes, and therefore it's a global lender. This is a dance. It takes two to dance, and we're dancing. The idea is that gradually we will all rebalance. That is, U.S. saving will rise, and to some extent it has with the current recession, rise relative to consumption. and the Chinese consumption will rise relative to production. That all sounds wonderful. What's the problem? Well, one of the problems is this is much harder to achieve than it is to promise. You can already think about that in our own country. We're trying to raise consumption to deal with the persistently high unemployment. In China, the political economy of this is really not very promising, I think. We have many political elites who are tied to continuing subsidization of investment in corporations, Chinese corporations. That would basically have to be moderated, and ordinary Chinese consumers would have to be empowered to consume more. Financial repression would have to be moderated. These are basically anti-elite policies in some way, and well, they are. And therefore, I think that we would have to see very strong political will for this to be done. And the question is whether that would begin to have issues related to internal political stability. In the United States, if we think about our own situation, we can realize how hard it is here to rebalance and the difficult decisions that we're having now with long-term financial structural imbalances in the budget deficit. Okay, lastly, I would just point out that there are a lot of possibilities for what we can think of as win-win outcomes, or ways in which the two sides can benefit from mutual cooperation and understanding. First is, of course, that the gains from trade have been shared widely. It's difficult sometimes, especially as we are now in we're still in a weak recovery, for us to believe that there are gains from global engagement. But they have been achieved. There is, of course, the larger issue, which is how do China and India enter into the global economy? What kinds of repercussions will that have for those of us who are living in relatively well-off countries, as well-off citizens of well-off countries? So, you know, these are difficult issues. It's sometimes hard to see the gains that can be made from mutually gainful trade, but I think that we have many people who see them, in particular corporations and enterprises in China, lobby for continuing economic relations. In the United States, of course, we have strong support for continuing open trade and open access for corporations to investment locations, structuring the organizations as they choose. So this does have a built-in support for continuing moderation of the political rhetoric. So there are many more things that we can say, and I'm sure there will probably come up in questions.
I'm not mic'd, so I'm going to stand over here. And I'd like to start out by thanking Stephanie Lee and her colleagues in COMPAS for organizing this event. And thank you for doing all that. And I am going to talk about culture and education and public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy. And this, I think, is really one of the tools that Jim was referring to in terms of having the capacity to build mutual trust and improve understanding between the two countries. I'm going to talk first, after a brief introduction, about the ways in which culture has improved cooperation and trust. But then I'd like to mention some obstacles and some concerns that I have about the cultural front. I think we all realize that culture is important because it does influence, as Jim was pointing out earlier, it does influence and shape our images and our opinions and our values. And we often take it for granted. But we also, I think, generally believe that cultural and educational exchange are an antidote to stereotypes and misperceptions. And the idea here is that if we could just get people together, whether they're students or leaders, political leaders, military leaders, economic business leaders, if we could just get them together to share their thinking that we will achieve better understanding. We will realize that everybody has similar wants and needs, even though we may be coming from different places. And we'll be able to resolve these misunderstandings. I think there actually is considerable truth to this belief, but the reality, of course, is a lot more complicated. For China and the United States, culture is contested territory. Both countries, not just the United States, but as Jim said earlier, both countries see themselves as exceptional. Both are large continental powers. The history of relations between these two nations is just full of contradictions, full of misperceptions and contradictory images. China views and has viewed the United States as a model and a partner on the one hand, but also as a bully and as a hegemon seeking to contain the PRC. The United States, for its part, oscillates between seeing China either as successful and powerful, and Mary talked about the economic part of the equation, or as backward and weak. And so China is either just about to dominate the world and take over in terms of security issues or economic issues, or it's on the verge of collapse. China is just going to fall apart because this authoritarian system cannot be sustained. So these wildly differing, alternating positive and negative images have created, I think, over a long period of history, a love-hate kind of mentality that is volatile and misleading. And in recent decades, really, the popular image of China has been dominated much more by the negative side, the negative perception of China as a threat. Last fall, when Xi Jinping's ascendancy to the chairmanship and presidency of China was announced, Time magazine ran this cover of Xi Jinping. And if you can't see it, it says, "The next leader of the unfree world," right? And he's all color-coded in red. Now, so this is not a neutral or objective statement about Chinese politics. This is inflammatory, to say the least. And this is really a Cold War kind of mentality. And so I think that the media, which has improved considerably in terms of China coverage, often does a disservice. By contrast, I would argue that cultural and educational exchange between China and the US has produced more balanced views. Let me just tick off a few examples of this. More Americans are studying the Chinese language now than ever before. There are a growing number of dual language, immersion language programs at the elementary school level. In the state of Utah, this may come as a surprise to you, it certainly did to me. In the state of Utah, there are 17 elementary dual language immersion programs. Partly because of business, partly because of the Mormon missionary heritage. High school students in the US can now take advanced placement exams in Mandarin Chinese. That's been true for the last few years. As of last year, according to the IAE statistics, the Institute of International Education, 25% of all international students in the United States came to the US from China. 25%. It's a staggering number. And what's even more interesting, I think, is that 38% of the total of 194,000 students are now undergraduates. This is a phenomenal change in a very short period of time. By comparison, 14,500 Americans went to China, so there's a real disparity there, but both sides, both governments, are working to increase these numbers. I think it's worth adding that many of the Chinese who've studied abroad in the United States and other countries have gone back to China and have had far-reaching influence in higher education and other sectors in Chinese society, in fields like international finance, international law, public administration. introducing courses that just didn't exist before in China on topics like human rights, gender, and the environment. Certainly in think tanks, NGOs, foundations, arts organizations, and the U.S. government itself, we see an incredible array of programs that do encourage cooperation and collaboration. And many of these programs, and this is another twist in the relationship, many of these programs now are being funded from the Chinese side, from Chinese government sources. I'll come back to that in a moment. I think it's also worth mentioning that American families have adopted nearly 70,000 children from China, most of them girls. And this is another form of cultural exchange that has enriched American perceptions of China. However, and here I come to the other side. Cultural exchange is not without its problems and its pitfalls, and it does not automatically lead to more positive or more realistic perceptions. There are concerns, there are obstacles. Number one, and I thank Jim for already kind of providing some historical background to this, so I can do a little less. And I would just add to as a footnote, America's rhetoric about China has never really matched up to the reality. During World War II, for example, when the relationship was close, when we were allies against Japan, Franklin Roosevelt saw China as an anchor for freedom and democracy in the future after the war, but the commitment to China never really amounted to all that much. And the Chinese, I think, grew rather cynical about what the Americans really were up to. But I think even more important is a deeply held assumption on the part of the United States, and this goes way back, that the United States has the right or the obligation to share its values with the rest of the world. And this leads to the idea that the United States should change China or remake China in its own image. Before the communist victory in 1949, diplomats, businessmen, and soldiers and missionaries all thought that China should be changed and should become a democratic, capitalist, Christian nation. And when China embarked on its reforms with Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, I think Americans were tantalized by the idea that China would somehow embrace a more open, more liberal, democratic system. And China has changed tremendously. It has become more open and I think more liberal. This all came to a head with Tiananmen in 1989 with the so-called democracy movement. And again, you saw this return of the love-hate cycle because there was a sense that the China that had been rediscovered by the United States had somehow now been lost all over again. So the Chinese interpret these intentions on these hopes of changing China as a peaceful evolution. And they see this as a strategy to subvert Chinese values and undermine the Chinese state. The second area of concern has to do with scholarship. It turns out that the U.S. academic study of China really has much more depth than China's studies of the United States. So here we don't have a trade deficit, we have a cultural deficit or an academic deficit. It's kind of the flip side. On the U.S. side, Chinese studies cover virtually all aspects of Chinese history and culture and society. However, American scholars are not always very effective in sharing their views about China beyond the classroom, and scholars have to compete with any number of special interest groups on issues such as Tibet and Taiwan and trade. We have a lot of voices out there. On the Chinese side, there's tremendous interest in American popular culture, but there have been relatively fewer opportunities for Chinese scholars to really have an in-depth, nuanced understanding of what drives the United States at a cultural level. What are the values, the underlying values that explain American policies? And religion would be a very good example of that. The Chinese scholars have had fewer opportunities because they've had to be pragmatic. They haven't had the resources to invest in American studies the way Americans have invested in Chinese studies. And so we have a gap there. And the Chinese, I'm really just quoting Chinese scholars and Chinese colleagues on this. And I think they are ready to go further and go deeper in terms of understanding American culture and doing field work, for example. Third area of concern is soft power and cultural diplomacy. Beijing, now that it has got the economic might and growing military power, believes, I think, that it has to have the soft power to complement the economic and the security sides. They've invested very heavily in soft power. And the prime example of this was the 2008 Olympics, of course. I think something like $4 billion went into that. What are the reasons for this? Well, number one is to enhance China's prestige as a big power. Number two, to create a favorable environment for China's continued peaceful rise. And number three, and this is important, I think, in terms of U.S. China perceptions, number three is to counter concerns of China as a threat to the outside world. So some observers do see this as an area of competition between the two countries. China has invested very heavily in newspapers, television, internet, and so forth to present the Chinese point of view. And probably the flagship program has been the Confucius Institutes. These are mainly for teaching Chinese language. And they've had surprising success because the Chinese have been quite flexible. They've given these Confucius Institutes, which are typically attached to universities, a great deal of autonomy. There are 75 Confucius, or more now, 75 CIs in the United States, about 350 worldwide. And so it's quite a phenomenon. But it's, I think, worth noting that the name is important. These are Confucius Institutes. They're not Mao Zedong Institutes or Deng Xiaoping Institutes. And I think this points to an underlying problem in Chinese society. The Chinese government is glorifying harmonious values of a distant past and is reluctant to export its lively, diverse, contemporary culture. I can't imagine that the Chinese government was an exhibition of the artist Ai Weiwei. But if they did, just think of the implications. Think of what kind of statement that would be. So what they're doing through this Confucius Institutes, I think, is not an accurate reflection of Chinese reality, but it actually reinforces American stereotypes of China as a refined, ancient, distant, superior civilization. On the U.S. side, public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy has had a different set of problems. In 2011, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee reported that the United States was losing an information war with China because China was blocking American efforts to engage Chinese citizens. So here we have parallels with rhetoric about and discussion about trade. And so the United States has no equivalent of Confucius Institutes in China. I think it should be added that the United States effort to kind of introduce Americans in China has also been limited, not just by the Chinese policies, but also by congressional budget cuts, tighter security for American institutions overseas, and much greater attention to the Muslim world. So in the final analysis, the diversity and the vitality of American life is not conveyed by public diplomacy through government channels, but it's really through individuals and institutions in the private sector. The soft power really comes from, as Joe Nye said, sources that range from Hollywood to Harvard, from Madonna to the Gates Foundation, from Martin Luther King's speeches to Barack Obama's election. And he says it's not easy for governments to sell their country's charm if their narrative is inconsistent with domestic realities. So in conclusion, people-to-people exchange, cultural exchange, public diplomacy has improved perceptions and it has enhanced cooperation. and mutual trust and understanding, but it's not a panacea, and there are problems. So we need to recognize the cultural differences, we need to understand that they're real, understand the history, appreciate our motives, where they're similar, where they're different, and understand the role of perceptions in all of this. So there's much to celebrate, I think, much has been accomplished, but there's still much to be accomplished. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much to our panelists. We have time for just a few questions from the audience. Rami's going to be circulating around with the microphone, so if you have one, please just raise your hand and he'll find your way to you.
This question is for Dean Steinberg. You mentioned several ideas that you may have or that we can do as the U.S. to make sure that we rise or try to rise as peacefully. You said there's some concrete issues. I don't know if that's additional bilateral agreements or additional partnerships, that, multilateral organizations. What were some of the ideas that you had?
So, I mean, I think, at the end of the day, I feel very strongly that the only way you deal with these structural sources, both unique to the relationship and general to these, is to deal with concrete problems. That too much of the difficulty has been, and Terry suggested those two, sort of broad protestations, goodwill, peaceful rise, put on power and stuff, but not convincing either side. So the question is, what is convincing? And it's considered taboo in discussing U.S. China relations to think about the experience between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I don't mean to imply that the relationship has the same ideological antagonism that the United States and the Soviet Union had. But I think it's actually useful because it's an a fortiori case. If the United States and the Soviet Union could manage some of these sources of structural tension, then surely the United States and China can. And so what we learned during the Cold War was that allowing the security dilemma to play out in its own terms was a loser for everybody. It led to arms races, it led to crisis instability, it led to the risk that small incidents could blow up into ultimately a nuclear war. And we developed a set of tools, of confidence building, of reassurance around specific problems that helped us manage the relationship while the other political differences played out. And so issues like transparency, open skies, for example, was an agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union that allowed us to know a little bit more about what the other side was doing, and therefore reduce fears that were hidden intentions. You read today, for example, in some more extreme, and I do mean extreme, U.S. press about, for example, allegations that China is hiding away hundreds or maybe thousands of undeclared nuclear weapons in caves. Not very credible. Nobody, I think, in the U.S. gives it a lot of credibility, but it's out there. And so how might transparency help each side deal with what the real capabilities of the other side are? Now, there are obviously costs. You have to be prepared to let the other side know more. You lose some of the advantages of secrecy. But transparency is tremendously valuable in building trust because you know what you're dealing with. And you can at least dispel the more extreme anxieties about that. So I think transparency, openness, and some of the lessons that we learned, declaring military exercises before they happen. So we know what's going to happen so people aren't surprised. They don't mistake it for potentially operationally dangerous activities on the other side. You can both be aware of it, so not be surprised and have to deal with surprise, but also allow you to adjust so you don't end up, inadvertently running into each other and having conflicts. Incidents at sea, another agreement that existed between the United States and Soviet Union doesn't exist between now and China. How do you deal with these accidents when and if they happen? If a U.S. vessel runs into a Chinese fishing vessel or the opposite. Again, ways to manage it. Things about, and then ultimately agreements or understandings, either formal or informal, about what each side is going to do. From the Chinese side, we have developed a kind of a tacit understanding that the United States is not seeking to negate Chinese second strike nuclear capability. We've never formally accepted that the way we did with the Soviet Union through the ABM Treaty. But there are things that we could do in terms of how we develop our missile defenses and how China developed its nuclear modernization that would give some confidence in each other's intentions. We could either do it by agreement, or we could make some commitments, unilateral commitments to each other that at least could be seen and monitored, that would help build confidence. We can deal with understandings about the deployment of military forces into controversial areas. So whatever we think about the disputes over the East China Sea and South China Sea, we could have some agreements about restricting the military exercises and military operations in those particular areas. So there's a number of tools that we have available. There are things we can do in cyber, there are things that we can do in space, all of which represent things that don't totally solve the problem, but give some indication that each side is understanding what worries the opposite side, getting into their own heads and understanding, okay, well, we do this because we think it's benign, but maybe the other side doesn't see that. Are there ways that we can accomplish the same objective without doing it in a way that's as dangerous? So again, back to the open skies point, each side is going to spy on each other, right? We know that. I mean, that's what states do. But when we moved from the U-2 to the open skies regime with the Soviet Union, we did it in ways that we had some rules of the road about what was acceptable. We understood that satellites would give some capability, but maybe were less dangerous than flying planes over the other guy's airspace, raised less issues of interference with sovereignty. There are lots of tools that are available to us to try to manage these things. Cyber is an area that's extremely important, and obviously has been a tremendous sense of insecurity now, and fed a tremendous amount of the China threat. So what's going on? Well, part of it is a belief that China is just using cyber for an economic advantage. I mean, very little stuff like this. China is completely denied. Well, there are things that we know how to do that would help us get some confidence about whether the Chinese were really serious about not promoting economic espionage or not. We could have joint investigations, right? We could agree that both sides, when one side worried that there was an act of economic espionage or IPR violation, that we would create joint investigations. Since neither side is claiming these are national security issues that should not be blocked by the argument that we can't touch these national security things. If the Chinese want to convince us that they're not stealing, corporate secrets here, then when we feel that there is one, we could have a joint border police intellectual property protection investigation, or at least ask the Chinese to do it and report back to us in credible ways about what we do. Crazy? No. We actually do this now with respect to non-proliferation. For a long time, the United States had a very strong concern that China was facilitating proliferation, either directly through the government or through not enforcing laws against their own companies, which were selling dual-use technology in the Pakistani nuclear program, North Korea, and others. But what ended up happening is we ended up with an agreement that when the United States had a concern, that the Chinese would investigate and report back to the United States on its efforts to try to track these things down and the results of this investigation. Hasn't solved all the problems, but has probably reduced tensions in this space by 80 to 90%. In part because China's done a better job of enforcing it, but in part because there's some credibility when they say, well, we looked into it and we didn't find it, because they do prosecute and pursue the ones that they do find, that at least there's some, again, confidence, trust, being built not by trust me, I'm a good guy, but through the concrete actions they take. So that, to my mind, and you can trace this across all the contested realms, and presumably there are economic equivalents of this as well, things that we do, that allow each side, the word I like to use is reassure them that the reality is consistent with the record.
So thank you. It's a very interesting panel, a very interesting discussion. I have a brief two-part question, I guess. The first is, Dean Steinberg, you mentioned the work of Bob Jervis on the security dilemma, and something that Jervis has often advocated as a way of alleviating the security dilemma is defensive military doctrines, defensive force structure, which is obviously a very broad sort of strategic measure you can take. And I was wondering what you thought and what the other panelists might think about the efficacy of that as an approach, or if that's not practical in practice. And then also, with all the tensions on the Korean Peninsula, I think it would be interesting to hear all of your views on how the state of affairs on the Korean Peninsula factors into Chinese-American mutual perceptions of one another, and the actions they take in regards to their allies, their respective allies on the Korean Peninsula, how that impacts how they see each other.
Those are both great questions. The challenge, I mean, it sounds good to talk about defensive doctrines, but the problem is, one, almost by definition, capability, it's hard to distinguish a capability which is defensive versus non-defensive. So, for example, in the most, we haven't talked about it happily, we could talk about it, one of the biggest difficulties in U.S. China relations has been Taiwan, right? And the U.S. view has been, well, you know, on the one hand, we think this should be resolved peacefully, and, you know, we think it's more likely to be peaceful if Taiwan doesn't feel so vulnerable that they're going to get overrun by China. So we have this provision in the Taiwan Relations Act, the U.S. policy, that we will provide military assistance, arms sales, to Taiwan, but only defensive arms, right? So we spent all this time, and it's a very contentious issue because, I mean, first of all, China doesn't buy that we should sell any arms to Taiwan. But even within that, what's a defensive arm? Is an F-16 defensive or not defensive? Well, it's clearly defensive in the sense that it prevents the Chinese Air Force from overwhelming Taiwan, but it has air-to-ground capability, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, and there's a spectrum. Some things are more offensive, things are less. And it's certainly true that there are important discussions that could be had about doctrine that might be reassuring. The extreme case is on the nuclear side, as we did with the Soviet Union, where we basically had a discussion about why each side could take some decisions not to have the capability of a preemptive first strike against the other, and then they would make decisions about force structure and doctrine that made that very implausible. So even though we have very powerful, very capable, very accurate long-range nuclear forces, the structure of the forces were such that they couldn't deliver first strike capability. That's obviously going to be important in discussing the offense-defense problem with missile defenses. But I think there's a limit to that, and I think the limit can be seen in some specific cases. So, you know, for China now, the focus of their military modernization is what American strategists call access denial, area denial capabilities. From a Chinese point of view, that's about as defensive as it gets, right? You're just trying to keep the other guy further away from your territory so they can't come close to your shores and wipe you out. But from the U.S. point of view, this is an offensive capability pushing the United States out of the West Pacific, denying our ability to protect our allies and the like. And there's no simple answer to that in terms of what are the capabilities. An anti-ship cruise missile, an anti-ship ballistic missile looks, you know, very offensive to a carrier. It looks very defensive to the guys trying to keep the carrier away from being able to project its power onto their land. So I think there's a limit to how much you can use defense as a, you know, defensive defense. This was a big shibboleth in Europe in the 70s and 80s where people were trying to say, well, how can we give the Soviet Union some confidence that we only want to protect what we have and not go after. So I think there are, on the margin, there are some places where we can you know, talk about defensive doctrines, defensive deployments and the like, but I don't think in the end that's going to be satisfactory. Another really good example is in space, right? So if you're the Chinese, an anti-satellite capability is very defensive because you don't want the United States to have the high ground and be able to use space to project offensive capability. But if you're the United States, where we depend, you know, on our eyes and ears to defend us, the capacity of China to knock out our satellites is a highly offensive and destabilizing capability. So again, I think there's a limit to what can be done there. On the Korea issue, you know, it's an evolving situation because, you know, it obviously takes place against the background of, you know, the Korean War and the historic alliance between North Korea and China, where North Korea was seen as a strategic ally as well as an ideological compatriot of China, but which now is not so obvious. I mean, and there's a great debate, I think, now in China about how much of an asset it is, how much it's in the interest of China for the North Korean regime to continue at all. At the same time, there was a lot of anxiety in China about what would happen if North Korea disappeared. And not just the refugees flowing into China, but also how would it affect the strategic situation of China to have an ally on China's border, and even more extreme, U.S. forces stationed in a U.S. ally on China's border. So this is an area where there's elements of trust, there's an agreement that North Korea shouldn't be a nuclear state, and there's elements of cooperation, but also a lot of anxiety, and a place where I think that there is some chance. I mean, that is, it's very hard to do, but one could imagine, again, in my concept of reassurance, of a serious dialogue between the United States and China, first about what to do if there were a crisis in North Korea, a collapse and the like. But second, and though very sensitive, well, how could we arrange things if Korea became unified? Because after all, both sides technically accept the idea that Korea should be reunified. What would be an acceptable arrangement for Korea after reunification that met the needs of both sides? We did reach that with the Soviet Union again. Could we have that conversation now to at least, if we couldn't get full agreement worked out, at least understand what the no-nos are on both sides, and therefore give each other some reassurance that whatever happens, the worst won't come to bear.
Well, I was going to take it in a little different direction, which is that the North Korea situation is played out a little bit in all expansions of Chinese economic interests. For example, the South Korean side has, many scholars have liked to argue that China is in some sense a bad investor into North Korea because it's mainly just depleting their mineral wealth without providing any economic development. And these types of claims follow China as it moves into Africa and other places. Of course, China is not the first country to invest in another country to exploit mineral wealth. And in fact, a new book out by a political scientist named Deborah Brodigan is very powerful at showing that the relationships are much more multifaceted than this simple one-dimensional view of Chinese investment would suggest. So I think that in this sense, the culture, or the scholarship is actually doing some good in terms of showing the fuller dimensions of the relationships.
Just to add on Korea, I think the recent vote in the United Nations, where China supported sanctions against North Korea, was really quite significant, and it may be some kind of a turning point. I have to imagine that some of the very bellicose rhetoric that we're seeing from DPRK now is partly a result of a underlying concern, underlying question about what China's position is going to be on North Korea. Are they going to be the ally that we can rely on, or are they going to cut off the supplies at some point? But it seems as though with that vote for sanctions, China has reached a point where they said, you guys crossed a line. You went too far, and you did this during the National People's Congress when we were installing our new leadership, and we didn't. That wasn't very good timing. On the USSR U.S. analogy, I guess I would just add that, of course, the big difference with China is the economic relationship, which we never had with the Soviet Union. And the only other thing I would say is that I think for China, the Soviet Union is a huge issue, and it is a question of perceptions. That is, the fundamental question is, why did the Soviet, and how did the Soviet Union fail? And how can we prevent that from happening with the Chinese Communist Party? I think the revitalization of the party has largely been in response to that interpretation of the collapse of the USSR back in the early 90s.
Let me just say one more thing on Korea, because I think it really is a wonderful illustration of the perception and misperception problem. So, the American point of view, and you see this in the press and Congress, if China were really serious about North Korea's nuclear program, they would really crack down and get tough. And so the fact that they don't proves that China isn't very serious, or is Chinese say to you, we completely agree with you about the nuclear program, but the worst thing to do is crack down on the top because they'll just drive them in a corner, they'll get more defensive, and they'll want nuclear weapons even more. So you have a situation.
And we'll have refugees.
And we'll have refugees, but just, I mean, just on so here technically we share an objective, which is the denuclearization of the peninsula. And yet we often find ourselves at loggerheads because we each mistrust the other's actions, which we think, the Chinese say, you're not really interested in the nuclear thing, you just want a regime change in North Korea. And we say, you're not really interested in the nuclear thing because you just want to protect these guys. And so even though theoretically we have a lot of common interest here, the doubts about the other's intentions, because they're not doing what we think they should do, leads to, or the fact that they're not doing things leads to doubts about the perceptions. And trying to figure out how you get around that, and particularly to find ways where you genuinely disagree about the means, and yet not have that bleed over about whether that also reflects a difference about goals, is a big problem.
Could I just add a word on Taiwan back to that? Because I think that's so important, it's so central. In my sense is that the Taiwan-China relationship has improved a great deal, not because of U.S. policy, as Jim suggested, that hasn't really changed. We do continue to sell arms from the U.S., but it's changed because Taiwan has backed away from the idea of independence, but also because the economic relationship between Taiwan and China, the mainland, has become so tight, so close, and you've got so many Taiwanese now living and working in China. And so I think that's a huge way in which the economic side, the trade, has influenced the perceptions on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. But really has a lot less to do with changing U.S. perceptions.
So recently, the new leader of the Chinese new leader, Xi Jinping, just finished his first state visit. And he went to Russia and African countries. So in your opinion, what signals do you think that sent out about foreign policies of this new Chinese administration? And also before looking, what do you think will be the most significant changes in terms of the U.S.-Sino relationship with this new administration?
So I think, it's a great question. Again, it goes to this important discussion, which is, that from any objective level, the idea that China and Russia are going to form this new strategic alliance against the United States is a very implausible story. There are lots and lots of reasons which we can know why it's not true. And so if you're not kind of trying to over-interpret these things, you say to yourself, well, where should he have gone to first, right? I mean, you got to go to the United States first? No, for obvious reasons. First of all, he's been in the United States when he was vice president, but second, be odd. Is he going to go to Japan? No, that's for sure. Is he going to go to India? No, they still having border wars. So, I mean, in some ways, that's a safe first place for China to be done. But, as you suggest, whatever the underlying reality is, because I think it's totally been on me in one bit, but it's very easy in the misperception game to say, oh, you see, they're trying to play triangular diplomacy. It's the mirror image of what happened during the Cold War when China and the United States got together to balance against the Soviet Union. Now China Xi Jinping wants to balance against the United States by. So while I genuinely don't think that was the motivation, I think there were plenty of other reasons why he did it. It's easy to get the perception in the United States that that's what it was about. What are the other things? So the other big thing people say, what are the other early steps that Xi Jinping has said? Well, he's been talking about the China dream, right? And, well, perfectly reasonable thing, but if you're looking at this through the lens and the suspicion and the doubt, it's, whoa, what's that all about? This is, China that can stand up, say no, all of that. So all of these things are very important because they are subject to various interpretation, and without managing those perceptions and misperceptions, there is a danger that they will create self-fulfilling narratives about each other. And leaders have a great deal of responsibility to try to think about that. And I think that this is one of the things that does take place in dialogue. A lot of reason why we have these so-called track 2 dialogues of non-governmental things is where we can say things to each other to be very hard. It's very hard for President Obama to say, don't go to Russia because the Americans will think you're doing this. But it's possible for people who know China well and who know the United States well to have these dialogues with each other, to sensitize each other to the danger of perception and misperception and these kinds of things. Same with the American pivot, right? I mean, we think this is a very benign, positive thing. The Chinese are absolutely convinced. And so a lot of conversation needs to take place to explain what it is, what it isn't, why you shouldn't overinterpret it, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, it's fascinating that the President of the United States has not been to Africa outside of Egypt. But I think a lot of... Was that not true? South Africa?
And Ghana.
Okay, I
At
misspoke.
least. I mean, those are the
Okay,
two
I'm
that I
sorry.
know about.
I misspoke. But I think China's obviously got deep economic interests, but is well aware of criticisms of the idea of extracting resources. And so I think Xi Jinping is very logically, and it's a long trip, 9 days or something, in several countries. I think he's trying to counter that image and say we're not just exploiting Africa. We want to be partners. We want to be cooperative. So I think that's an important part of the equation as well.
All right, we're going to start wrapping up. So thank you again to the panelists for coming and participating in this wonderful discussion.